The costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish supergroup is back.
He is the man behind the piano, the architect of some of the most recognizable melodies in pop history, and for more than 5 decades he has shaped the sound of ABBA without ever standing at the front of the stage. Benny Andersson, born in December 1946, turned 78 in the winter of 2024, going into 2025, and across a long career that stretches from a Stockholm folk band to a virtual arena in London. His story is one of quiet persistence rather than dramatic confession. This is not a tale of scandal. It is the story of a craftsman, told through the documented facts of his life, his music, and the slow, undramatic way that ABBA actually came together and came apart. Benny Andersson was born Goran Breer Benny Andersson on December 16, 1946 in the Väsastan district of Stockholm, the son of a civil engineer father, Gosta, and his wife Leila. He grew up largely in the suburb of Vällingby. Long before synthesizers or recording studios entered his life, music was already a daily presence in the Andersson household, carried not by ambition but by family tradition. Both his father and his grandfather, Ephraim, were enthusiastic accordion players, and it was this quiet domestic ritual. 2 generations of men pulling at the bellows of an accordion in a Stockholm apartment that planted the seed of Benny's musical life. At 6 years old, Benny was given his own accordion. He didn't take to it through formal lessons. Rather, he pushed at its buttons and keys until he could pick out the Swedish folk songs that were already part of the soundtrack of his childhood. By the time he was 10, he had moved on to the piano, and it became clear fairly quickly that conventional music lessons weren't really his style. He preferred to learn by ear, picking up instruments and working out how they function on his own terms. This self-taught, intuitive relationship with music would go on to define his entire career. He became someone who could absorb an instrument quickly and instinctively, without needing to be taught its rules first. By 15, Benny had left school and begun playing in youth clubs and local bands around Stockholm. His early romantic life intertwined with his music as well. He became involved with Christina Granville, and in 1964 the pair joined a folk music ensemble called Elverket Spelmanslag, the Electricity Board folk music group, whose repertoire leaned toward instrumentals. Benny and Christina would later have 2 children together, Peter and Helene, born in 1963 and 1965 respectively, before Benny's career pulled him toward the road and toward a very different kind of fame. What's worth noting here is how different this beginning was from the glossy pop machine ABBA would later become. Benny's foundation wasn't built on chasing trends or studying the charts. It was built on Swedish folk melodies, accordion runs, and the structural patience that comes from learning music by ear rather than by formula. Decades later, longtime collaborators and critics would point to this background as the reason ABBA songs, however catchy, carried an underlying melancholy that distinguished them from other pop of the era. Andersson himself addressed this directly in a 2002 speech, reflecting on how the long, dark Scandinavian winters shaped the emotional undertone of Nordic music, pointing composers like Sibelius and Grieg, and to a particular quality he heard in the voices of his own bandmates, Frida and Agnetha, as carrying that same northern melancholy. In October 1964, 18-year-old Benny joined a band called the Hep Stars as their keyboardist. The Hep Stars were, by a wide margin, the most popular group in Sweden during the mid-1960s. They were nicknamed the Swedish Beatles, and Benny quickly found himself not just performing, but writing original material for the band. His first song was called No Response. It was followed by Sunny Girl, a song that became his first genuine hit, and one that drew attention even beyond Sweden's borders. It was while touring with the Hep Stars that Benny crossed paths in June 1966 with a young songwriter named Björn Ulvaeus, who was performing at the time with a folk group called the Hootenanny Singers. The two started writing together almost immediately. Their first collaborative song, Isn't It Easy to Say, was recorded by the Hep Stars, and from there the partnership grew steadily. By spring 1969, Benny and Björn had scored their first real hits as a songwriting duo. Ljuva's Sexidal, a hit for singer Brita Borg and Spielman, recorded by the Hep Stars themselves. This songwriting partnership is the real engine behind everything that followed. Unlike many pop duos defined by personal rivalry, Benny and Björn settled early into complementary roles. Benny built the chords, the harmonic structure, the musical architecture of a song, while Bjorn and later lyricist collaborators shaped the words and narrative. It was a division of labor that worked because each partner trusted the other's instincts completely, and remained essentially unchanged for the rest of their working lives together, surviving ABBA's rise, its breakup, and decades of separate musical projects afterward. Around the same period, the personal lives of the future ABBA members began to intertwine with their professional ones. Benny met Annie Frid Lyngstad, known to fans simply as Frida, and Bjorn became involved with Agnetha Faltskog, whom he would marry in July 1971. As the two couples began supporting one another in the studio, joining each other on backing vocals and recording sessions, the sound of the women's voices started to suggest something to Benny and Bjorn. The possibility of building a vocal group modeled loosely on contemporary acts like Blue Mink, Middle of the Road, and Sweet, all of whom were finding international success blending pop hooks with rich vocal harmony. The four of them performed together under various names through the early 1970s, including a short-lived touring act called Festfolket that did not find much success. But the chemistry, both musical and personal, kept pulling them back together, and the group that would become ABBA officially coalesced in 1972. The breakthrough moment, the one that changed the trajectory of all four of their lives permanently, came on April 6, 1974, when the group won the Eurovision Song Contest, representing Sweden with the song Waterloo. It is hard to overstate how decisive this single moment was. Eurovision wins had launched careers before, but ABBA's victory set off a chain reaction that would build, over the following 8 years, into one of the best-selling musical acts in history. Current estimates put their total sales above 150 million records worldwide. During those 8 years, Benny and Bjorn wrote and produced 8 studio albums together, with Benny handling the bulk of the musical composition and arrangement while Bjorn focused on lyrics, often alongside the group's manager and frequent co-writer Stig Andersson. Interestingly, despite being one of the most photographed pop groups of the decade, Benny sang lead vocals on only a single ABBA track in the group's entire catalog, Susie Hang Around, from the Waterloo album. His role was never about being the voice out front. It was about being the architecture underneath everything the audience heard. This arrangement reflected something true about Benny's temperament that has come up again and again across decades of interviews and profiles. He was never chasing the kind of fame that came with being recognized on the street or photographed on magazine covers. What he wanted consistently was for the music itself to be heard clearly. Its structure, its harmonic choices, the layered vocal arrangements that took ABBA songs beyond simple pop formula into something more textured. Critics and biographers have often pointed out that ABBA's catchiest songs frequently carry an undercurrent of melancholy in their chord progressions, a tension between bright melody and minor key harmonic shifts that gives tracks like The Winner Takes It All or Knowing Me, Knowing You, their emotional weight beneath the surface. That tension is widely understood to be Benny's signature as a composer, bringing his Swedish folk roots and his ear for minor key sadness into songs that, on the radio, sounded like pure pop joy. ABBA's 8 years of active recording between 1974 and 1982 were defined by relentless productivity. Benny and Bjorn wrote and produced not just hit singles but full albums, constantly pushing the boundaries of what was technically possible in the studio at the time. They embraced multi-track recording and early synthesizer technology well ahead of many of their pop contemporaries, building dense, layered productions that drew comparisons, made by Andersson himself, to the so-called wall of sound approach pioneered by Phil Spector and the vocal harmony techniques of Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys, both acknowledged influences on ABBA's sound. This period also coincided with the personal relationships within the group reaching their most complicated point. 2 marriages existed simultaneously inside one working band. Bjorn and Agnetha married in 1971, and eventually Benny and Frida, who were a couple through much of ABBA's most productive years. Touring schedules, recording demands, and the simple difficulty of maintaining a marriage while also running a global pop business put enormous strain on both relationships. Bjorn and Agnetha divorced in 1979, while still actively recording and touring as part of ABBA, an arrangement that, by any reasonable account, must have been emotionally complicated for everyone involved, even as the band continued to produce hit records together. Benny and Frida's relationship also ended in 1981, shortly before the group's run came to a close. It is worth being clear here about what is documented and what is not. ABBA's members have, across the decades, generally been private about the granular emotional details of these relationship breakdowns, offering measured reflections in interviews rather than tell-all confessions. What is well established is that some of the band's most emotionally resonant later songs, particularly those on the 1981 album The Visitors, written and recorded after both marriages had ended, carry an unmistakable weight of heartbreak and weariness. Tracks like The Winner Takes It All, in particular, have long been understood by fans and critics alike as reflecting the real emotional fallout of Bjorn and Agnetha's divorce. Even though Bjorn has stated in interviews over the years that the lyrics were not a literal diary entry, but rather a dramatized, fictionalized treatment of universal heartbreak, written from a place of genuine personal experience. ABBA's ending was not marked by a dramatic falling out, a public feud, or a single defining event. Wikipedia's well-sourced summary of the group's history describes the band's final years as a gradual winding down rather than collapse, as the personal relationships within the group change, and as Agnetha and Frida increasingly pursued their own creative paths. The group's activity slowed. ABBA's last studio album, The Visitors, was released in 1981, and by December 1982 the group had effectively disbanded, though no formal, dramatic breakup announcement accompanied the moment. There wasn't a defining press conference or a public statement marking the end. The band simply stopped recording together, and its four members moved into the next phases of their separate careers. This matches the way Benny has generally characterized that period when he has spoken about it publicly over the years, not as a moment of rupture, but as something that happened gradually, almost without anyone formally deciding it. The pressures were real. 8 years of non-stop global touring, recording, and media attention would exhaust any group. But the picture that emerges from the historical record is one of quiet attrition rather than confrontation. What Benny did next says as much about him as anything he did during ABBA's active years. Rather than chasing a solo pop career or trying to replicate ABBA's commercial formula, he and Bjorn turned almost immediately toward musical theater, a much less commercially certain, more artistically demanding medium. Their first major post-ABBA project was Chess, a concept musical written with lyricist Tim Rice, exploring a Cold War-era love triangle set against the backdrop of a World Chess Championship. The Chess concept album was released in October 1984 and sold 2 million copies worldwide. It produced 2 enduring hits, I Know Him So Well, sung by Elaine Paige and Barbara Dixon, which topped the UK charts, and One Night in Bangkok, performed by Murray Head, which reached number 3 in the United States. Chess opened in London's West End in May 1986 to mixed but generally positive reviews and ran for roughly 3 years. A revised Broadway staging in 1988, however, was much less successful, closing after only 2 months. This divergence, a beloved concept album, a successful London run, and a Broadway flop, is itself telling. Even with 2 of the most accomplished pop composers of the era behind it, theatrical success was never guaranteed, and Benny's post-ABBA career involved real creative risk, not just coasting on past glory. Through the late 1980s, Benny continued exploring music rooted in his earliest influences. He released 2 solo albums, Klinga Mina Klocker in 1987 and November 1989, 2 years later, both leaning heavily into his original Swedish folk compositions and prominently featuring the accordion that had defined his childhood. The title track of Klinga Mina Klocker was an ambitious 11-minute orchestral suite, culminating in a choral finale featuring lyrics written by Bjorn and sung by an all-star Swedish female choir that included, notably, Frida. In 1993, Benny and Bjorn returned briefly to pop songwriting, producing and writing for Swedish singer Josefin Nilsson's English-language album Shapes. But their most ambitious project of the decade was Kristina Fran de Vemela, a musical centered on 19th-century Swedish immigration to America, based on Vilhelm Moberg's novels. It opened in Malmö in October 1995 and ran successfully in Sweden until 1999, deeply rooted in the same Swedish folk tradition that had shaped Benny as a child. He would later create an English-language concert version, simply titled Christina, staged at Carnegie Hall in New York in September 2009 and at London's Royal Albert Hall in April 2010. The project that would ultimately reintroduce ABBA's music to a generation who had never seen the band perform live was Mamma Mia, a jukebox musical built around 24 of ABBA's songs, written by British playwright Katherine Johnson. It premiered in London's West End in April 1999, and from there it became a genuine global phenomenon. Productions opened in Toronto in 2000, on Broadway in 2001, and in a Swedish-language version in 2005. The 2008 film adaptation, starring Meryl Streep, became the highest-grossing film in the United Kingdom that year, and a sequel, Mamma Mia! Here We Go Again, followed in 2018, with Benny serving as executive producer on both films. Mamma Mia! Did something unusual. It took songs originally built as standalone pop singles and wove them into a continuous theatrical narrative, forcing audiences to hear familiar melodies in an entirely new emotional context. For Benny, whose entire compositional approach had always been about embedding emotional depth beneath catchy surfaces, this was in some ways a vindication. Proof that the songs could carry dramatic weight on their own, outside the context of ABBA's original pop arrangements and stage personas. Throughout this period, Benny also kept working close to his folk roots through his own band, Benny Andersson's Orchestra, formed in 2001 and commonly known as BAO. The 14-piece ensemble, which includes members of the folk group Åsa Spelman alongside vocalists Helen Sjöholm and Tommy Korberg, blends Swedish folk tradition with pop, classical, and jazz influences. BAO has released a string of albums since 2001 and achieved consistent chart success and large open-air touring crowd in Sweden, even though the band has remained largely a domestic phenomenon rather than an international one, which, given everything about Benny's stated priorities over the years, seems to have suited him fine. One part of Benny's life that he has spoken about candidly, without the embellishment that tends to surround so much online content about him, is his history with alcohol. Across multiple interviews over the years, Andersson has acknowledged struggling with alcohol use for much of his adult life, a struggle that coincided, at least in part, with the punishing schedule and pressures of ABBA's most intense years of global fame. He has said that he stopped drinking around 2001 and has remained sober since. This is one of the few areas of his life where the public record actually supports the kind of vulnerability that so many fabricated tell-all videos try to manufacture artificially. Except that Benny's own account of it has always been measured rather than melodramatic, framed as a fact of his history, rather than a dramatic confession extracted for an audience. In December 1981, not long after ABBA's most turbulent creative period, Benny married Mona Norklit, a Swedish television presenter. The couple had one son together, Ludwig, born in January 1982, and by all available public accounts, they have remained married since. Benny's life away from the stage has generally been kept private and stable in a way that stands in sharp contrast to some of the more sensationalized narratives that circulate about him online. Recognition for Benny's body of work has come steadily, if not always loudly. He received an honorary professorship from the Swedish government in 2002 for what was officially described as his ability to create high-quality music that reached people around the world. A decade later, in 2012, he was awarded an honorary Doctor of Philosophy from Luleå University of Technology, and that same year, he won Sweden's Guldbagge Award for his film score, the documentary Palm. In 2017, he released Piano, a solo instrumental album recorded with engineer Lynn Fajal at R&B Studios in Stockholm, featuring solo piano renditions of songs spanning his entire career, a kind of quiet retrospective, stripped down to the instrument that started it all when he was 10 years old. The album earned him the Opus Classic Award in Germany the following year.